I now invite the Prime Minister to speak to the motion this House, as Pope Francis, would retire instead of waiting to die as a means to relinquish the papacy. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Audible.
Thank you. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. We think that Pope Francis has had a long and brilliant career advocating for those who he cares about the most, those in his home areas of Latin America, those who resonate with the left-wing liberal ideas that he so strongly believes in and believes the church needs to reform. But we think he may have reached the limit of what he has reached the limit of what he is able to achieve. We think the best thing for him to do in his interests is to step down as the Pope, to retire, and enjoy retirement, as well as shaping the direction of the Catholic Church. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on the direction of the Catholic Church. And thirdly, on his personal life. Firstly, on setup. 2 things to note in setup. The first thing to note in setup is how retirement works as a pope. And we think this simply works in the same way that the retirement of many other popes has worked in history. I think the most recent example to point to is Pope Benedict, who retired just before Pope Francis became the pope. And that is that they just step down or announce they're going to step down before they start the looking process for the next pope. And when the next pope is found, Pope Francis would retire and the next person would be anointed as Pope. He would continue to live in the Vatican as Pope Benedict did. He would continue to be engaged in church affairs. He no longer has to take the face responsibility of being the Pope and all the responsibilities that comes with, though. The next thing to say in setup is what are the interests of Pope Francis. As we signal in introduction, he is a unique Pope compared to the other popes of the past, which is that he is Latin American rather than being from Europe. He is uniquely a left-wing liberal pope, specifically quite left-wing and liberal for the church. And these are values he's had all through his career, not just when he became the pope. He's quite a liberal bishop and, when he practiced in Argentina. And I think these values show that he has a goal that he wants to change the papacy and change the direction of the Catholic Church to become far more become far more liberal and more accepting of ideas that are normalized and outside of church society. And this is an urge and a religious obligation he feels to change the church towards this direction. However, we think that he has done as much as he can. And you can see this in society because of the fact that lots of these changes that Pope Francis did were made quite early in his papacy. He talks about his wanting to adopt contraception more liberally quite early in his papacy. He talks about the change and reforms he wants to make to viewing homosexual relationships quite early in his papacy. And he's probably been constrained by other more conservative ministers around him to not be able to push any further than that, which is why he hasn't been able to make as many changes or as many directional changes recently. We think, therefore, his goal and religious urge will be able to be fulfilled far better once he steps back from the Catholic Church. The second incentive he has is just for his personal life. He doesn't want to take too much time away from the end of his life and wants to be able to enjoy it. Before I move on, I'll take that POI from CEO.
Eastern Europe is pretty Catholic, and you still have huge amount of advancements that could be made for LGBTQ rights and people like Viktor Orban who passed anti-LGBTQ policy. Do you think enough has been done already in those areas?
No, I didn't say enough has been done. I said that he's reached the maximum that he personally is able to do. Not that we couldn't just reform the Catholic Church more. All right, next then, let's talk about the direction of the Catholic Church. And this will also be inherently responsive to that POI, although I think I've dealt with it enough already. Given that he has made as much change as he possibly can because those changes came early in his career and he hasn't had the ability to change as much forever, we still think those personal incentives of that religious urge still exist. He doesn't believe he's saved enough souls. He doesn't believe that he's, reformed enough things for LGBTQ plus individuals. To that religious person that Pope Francis is, his mission is viewed as entirely incomplete. And that is an act of harm that he has to deal with every day, that he will have to continue to deal with on side opposition if they do not prove that he is able to make substantial changes to meet that mission. Because he is constrained by church politics, it becomes particularly hard for him to make changes. It becomes particularly difficult for him to advocate personally because he is always the face of the Catholic Church. Always the Pope and always his public statements are constrained by what the Catholic Church wants to be able to put out. I think that's an incredible amount of guilt he has to feel on a daily basis. And I just want you, panel, to think about how you feel when you feel guilty that you've done something, the weight that that puts on you, the fact you have to live with that every moment of your life, every day until you make that right. Except he does not feel like he can make it right because church ministers constrain him at every corner. That guilt is weighing on him, and it's immense personal harm that he suffers every day. We think it is important for him, therefore, to maintain his legacy and want to go down the same track. It is important that they appoint the next pope to be someone who is along his vision, so that he's not just a blip in the history of the Catholic Church. They need that next person to commit to the similar ideologies, and we think that is only available when Pope Francis is around in the Vatican to be able to influence them, because he still lives in the Vatican, because he has a wealth of knowledge and expertise about this role that no one else living has, the lived experience of. We think it's quite likely that the next pope will seek advice from him in the same way that Pope Francis went out for coffee with Pope Benedict, or the Pope equivalent of that, to be able to get advice from that individual person. I think that's really important for him to ensure those dogmatic changes he's made in terms of accepting homosexual relationships and accepting contraception within the Catholic Church change into the future, or that he can criticize and shape the church outside of it because he's no longer constrained by the face of being the Pope, no longer constrained by his messaging by the Catholic Church, reading over every single one of his press statements. We think that influence for him is particularly important to get his voice back, to influence the next Pope. Next then, let's talk about his personal incentives, because even if you don't believe any of that Catholic Church stuff, like changing the Catholic Church better for once he's out of it, like not the Pope anymore stuff, I think on top of that active harm of them feeling guilty, there are some personal benefits that he would weigh over being in the church for much longer, which is that he's quite old. He's had quite a long career. And I would note that being the Pope is an incredibly taxing job. One, you have an incredible lot amount of responsibilities that take a lot of time. There's a lot of travel to other Catholic countries. He has to stand in the Vatican every Sunday to give mass, and that is a lot of time and a particularly taxing job. But secondly, it's also an emotionally frustrating job. It's basically like being a politician in your 80s, because you have to work and negotiate and deal with an immense amount of people who all have different incentives. I would find that, and I'm sure Pope Francis does as well, quite emotionally frustrated. These personal concerns overweigh his concerns about the direction of the church. Firstly, because the age has limited his ability to be able to make control. He's older, so it takes him more time to think of his thoughts. He finds it harder to string sentences together in order to be compelling. But secondly, he can see the end of his life on earth. And I think it's important for him that he can spend time doing the things he cares about the most, spending time with his nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters, spending time with his family members, and dedicating attention to the issues he cares the most about, like wage slavery in Latin America, for example, that the church currently constrains his ability to care about. He can only do that on earth, and he can only do it outside the Catholic Church.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I now invite the Leader of Opposition to commence the case for opposition bench. Here.
Hi, I just want to check that I am audible and visible.
Audible and visible.
All right. Quick POI preference. I would prefer it if POIs were offered via chat. All right. One sec. Setting up my timer. And collecting my notes. All right. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the reason opening government doesn't spend a lot of time talking about what he would do otherwise, outside of just saying, oh, maybe he'll spend time with some family members or whatever, and the happiness that he might get for that, is because they realize that for a man who has served in this position for so long, for a man who is 86 and is probably going to be free of his duties at age 86, there isn't really much that you can do. For this man, retirement is hell, and the fact and the harms of not being in this position far outweigh whatever pleasures OG tells you he may get if he retires. 2 arguments then within this speech. All of my responses are integrated. The first argument then on how this impacts the way the church is going to behave, and why the religion, and why Pope Francis deeply cares about this and the harms that come out of you retiring. First then, I just want to point out that Pope Francis does care about both the religion of Christianity and the church itself. I'm not going to spend a lot of time proving this because OG buys this, and like CG is presumably going to have to buy this as well unless they want to explicitly knife their opening. But like in short, it's because of the amount of time that he's invested into the religion to improve it, to ensure that more people go out and follow it, to ensure that like even though he's in a cushy position as the Pope, like go out into like the missions in Africa, in India, whatever, to ensure that it gets much and much better. So in note, we know that he does care deeply about the religion. You also know that he's deeply God-fearing because the fact that he's been involved in this religion for a long amount of time, that he believes in the scriptures, etc. What happens then if you retire? A number of things here. A, you are scared of God. Pope Francis never necessarily agreed with the decision that was made by the Pope before him, right? We know that there are many other people within the Catholic community who critiqued Pope Benedict for it. Now, maybe God is okay with or not okay with you abandoning your duty as a Pope, but truly, you don't know this as Pope Francis. Now, note, at the point at which you retire, when you're going to have to continue to struggle with the question of whether or not the decision you made was like theologically correct, you're not really living this stress-free, chill life that OG wants to talk about. You're still racked by guilt, and in fact, you're even more upset and scared because like your death is coming pretty soon, probably, and you are now more scared and worried about whether something you did or decision you made is right or wrong. Note specifically, the decision of resigning is irreversible. Even if you decide that this was the wrong decision to make, you are fucked because you realize that you cannot take back that power that you have forsworn God once, and now you can't make up for it. I want to note the nuance here. You can continue to work until you die. And I know it's dark, but like this is the truth of what happens to many popes. You can continue to do this on our side of the house, but you're never going to feel guilty for doing this because you know you're continuing to work within your best capacity, but working in the capacity of like the predecessors before you. Even if you're not putting in the most amount of work individually, you know you can still foresee the work that your cardinals are doing or other priests are doing as well. At that point, we think it makes more sense for you to stay within your position of power to ensure that you continue to work like this so you don't feel bad and feel like guilt-ridden at the point at which you give up this position in OG's world. The second thing I want to talk about here is what does succession look like? Now, I want to note something. So Pope Francis doesn't really have the full control over succession that OG tries to make it out. Because the way succession works within the Catholic Church is you have the cardinals, the second ranking individuals outside of the Pope, cast votes as to how the new Pope is selected. Many people, in fact, thought that Pope Benedict wanted a different Pope. I don't remember his name. I'm not that well versed with Catholicism. But like the Pope Francis was voted into power by the other cardinals. Now, sure, he may have gone on walks with Pope Benedict, and sure, they might have grown to like each other at the end. But the truth is that you never really know whether your successor is going to listen to you or not, and whether the cardinals are going to select someone that you approve of or not. Because the second you have no power and you are no longer the Pope, you have no real sway over the decisions of these cardinals. Because any decision that you make is a decision that you've made after you stepped outside of your position within the church. Even if you're a Pope Emeritus, which is what like Pope Benedict was, you are not as deeply respected and you have no real say over the decisions that are being made. This is because the more and more say you try to have over decisions, the more and more like it is that you are still Pope, and the more that threatened the other Pope becomes of their position of power as well. Now, I want to note some nuance here. Sure, there are two scenarios that can happen. Either the Pope that you are like that succeeds you continues to do your good work in improving the like Catholicism that you've tried, like you've done or whatever, or your successor is bad and goes back back against this. And I want to note some contextualization here. Not all of the cardinals love Pope Francis's work in liberalizing the religion. There are many vocal critiques of what he does as well. So you don't know that they're going to choose a successor who is good for you. The point here, via chat, the point here is that even if you even if they select a person who continues to do your work and is wonderful for you, that like you are likely to feel like you are missing out. That if this person is doing better work than you feel like you should have retired earlier, that you made a mistake in staying this long, and you're likely to feel racked by that guilt as well. The nuance here is that even if this person does a good job, you feel bad because you feel like you've made a mistake and should have stayed retired much earlier, a decision you can't control, regrets that you're going to continue to keep to the end of your your days. But if this person does worse, and we think it is likely because there's a lot of like, I guess, like counter things, whatever. And like Pope Francis is used to individually facing that criticism and knows how to like, like weather it, knows how to ensure that he continues to operate. But you don't, what really hurts you the most is seeing your life work go down the drain when someone else is able to undo the shit that you've done. CUG. OG. Yeah.
Please be comparative. How do you have more control over any of this if you're dead?
Right. The difference is you don't see it. So on your side of the house, you're going to watch this person dismantle the shit that you've done. Dismantle, explicitly use the verses of the Bible that support the more conservative stuff, that explicitly use the stuff and like explicitly like dismantle whatever work you've done, whatever. The difference is that if you're dead, you never fucking see it. So what essentially happens on our side of the house, on your side of the house, is that you live a life of regret. You live a life of what if. You see these institutions being dismantled, the work that you've put in, and you feel like everything you've worked on till now is in the and went down the drain. It's a decision that you shouldn't have made. You feel horrible. You can't even enjoy the time that you're spending with your family because you feel deeply wrong about it, because the internet criticizes you in this uniquely new world. On our side of the house, you never see that happen. So even if the new pope is worse than you or better than you, you never find out. And we think that is in and of itself much better, because you can at least lie to yourself and tell yourself that the new pope is going to be much better than you. The weighing for this argument is very simple. It might be a hard decision to continue to work. It might be physically strenuous, but the mental harm in never being able to sleep and never being able to truly understand what happened, regardless of whether or not your successor is good or bad, is a reason for why Pope Francis individually should never take this decision. Let him stay as Pope. So proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
You're audible.
I think the problem with a lot of opening opposition's claims about how Pope Francis might feel is based on this really weird assumption that you don't think about what's going to happen to you after your death, or happen to your legacy, or happen to everyone around you, because you do, right? Like the entirety of why we care about, for example, the last wishes of someone or the burial rites that people want to do isn't like a direct harm to them if you don't do that, because yes, they're dead, but it's because during their life, if they don't feel like they have some amount of control over what's happening afterwards, that is the harm that they feel. So similarly, if you feel like all the work you've done is likely to be out of your control when you die, and you have no ability at all to try and ensure that the long-term works, that all the work you've done actually gets pushed to the ground of like actually helping people, that is the exact harm that opening opposition describe that'll happen in their world, in the debate. I'm going to explain what Pope Francis can do otherwise, which is quite a lot, without this assertion that he has literally nothing to do, because if he's so old and can't do anything, then he can't do anything within the papacy as well. But I'm also going to explain why you actually, if you do care about your legacy, you do care about the direction of the Catholic Church, note the very nuanced analysis you hear to no response from Aisha at PM about his specific version or his specific vision for what the Catholic Church should be. That is the harm that if you don't have control over that legacy, he's probably going to feel if he just lets things go happen while he's around. The next thing I want to note before I go into all of the meat of this debate is a lot of the analysis that we hear from opening opposition is this idea of losing control, or the idea of not being able to make those changes. Note there's no response at all to the analysis we provide as to why Pope Francis isn't able to make that kind of change at the moment, has reached the maximum capacity the way the conservatives are constraining him at the moment to be able to do anything more. So which means that the constant power like he has, or feels like he has because he's the Pope, and the disconnect between what he can actually do is enhancing that feeling of guilt and enhancing the fact that he's not able to make that change. All of the analysis we provided to you, first, that he gets someone else that is more youthful, that is more able to push back against conservatives and has more control over the selection of that individual. But secondly, the fact that even if he's not the Pope and has much less power, that power is at least not constrained. So the feeling of what he can do versus what he wants to do or can do from his position, and what he can actually do without the constraints is much more aligned, which means that there's less guilt that he feels, because he knows I'm no longer the Pope, yes, but I can at least do something more than I can as I was a Pope. What would he do otherwise? He can still advocate advocate for those kinds of changes. He can write things. He can write op-eds to magazines. People listen to him because he's an old pope, right? Like, it's not like you lose control of the papacy because you were the pope. You were selected by God to be that. And a lot of people like Pope Francis, so he's going to have a very vocal ability to speak out against the Catholic Church if they try and do something, or just speak out parallel to the Catholic Church to still push his message through. And that's likely to still continue because of the respect he currently has. But also he could just do other things, set up charities, use that power he has and the cult of personality to do things like bring countries together for diplomacy, to make sure that countries actually provide welfare to people, those kinds of things, or change the internal workings of the Catholic Church within Latin America. He can go back to being a bishop and doing all those kinds of things. He can do way more than what he can do in the papacy. So why is that the case, right? The first is there are massive amounts of constraints that the Pope Francis has in order to make more changes than he already did. And the intuition pump that we give you that's based on just the empirical facts was a lot of those immediate changes happened very early on in his papacy, and there was a huge amount of conservative backlash from that. Let's just describe the backlash to explain what those constraints actually look like. So firstly, internally, as described by opening opposition, there is pushback against from conservative cardinals. And note that, popes can be replaced, and that's happened many times, given also popes do resign. There's going to be a big hoo-ha about this because like 5 popes have resigned in the past couple of years, not couple of years, but the past 50 years or something like that. But also externally, there are constraints because obviously you piss off rich conservatives that are the vast amount of donation that the Catholic Church gets. Then there's also those constraints in terms of what the internal other cardinals who might be in favor of you but care about the coffers of the Catholic Church would be able to let you do things. But also it takes time to trickle down those changes, right? Because just because the Catholic Church, the Pope says something, that doesn't immediately set down in policy like a government, but it has to go down, trickle down through all those Catholic churches, making those individual changes as it goes on. So there's only a limited amount you can do at any certain time. We're still in the process of all those huge changes to dogma actually trickling down in those instances. So it's very unlikely that they can do any more in this particular instance. There's a huge burden on side opposition to say, A, if he does really, really want to make those changes, and B, can make those changes, why hasn't he done that in the past 2 years? And why has every single change happened in the past? That's a huge burden of just like realism that they have to get over. But even if they can make more changes, those changes aren't guaranteed to continue. What we actually get you is more long-term commitment in that direction. Because firstly, yes, cardinals do vote, but you are able to advocate for a cardinal. Your presence there as people who have voted for you before and being alive in those areas, talking to cardinals, that's a huge amount of advocacy that you can't do when you're dead. But you can also influence the next pope regardless of who's chosen in that kind of face-to-face conversation about what works and what doesn't work, even to the extent that you get a pope that is against the full extent of your liberal values. You have against some ability to push those messages forward. But in the worst instances, you can criticize that backsliding. You can criticize the fact that they aren't doing as much as you thought of, which actually might change the minds of some cardinals, which might make the backsliding of the liberalism much less, which is far better protection of the direction of the church that you want to and their legacy than anything that opposition can get once you're dead, even if they make huge amounts of changes in the next, I don't know how long he's going to stay alive for. I'm going to make a claim on that, but not that long, right? Which means that he's not going to be able to make a huge amount of changes that they want to say. Let's get CO's POI. He's not. Like, Biden hasn't done shit, okay? Like, I think it's probably bad for Biden to run for president again, personally, given personal goals. And even if he had the same religious fervor over the Democratic Party, the amount of change that he can present versus the amount of cost it has to him physically, given the unresponded to analysis from Aisha, is insane, right? Because like that's the calculus you have to do about what you can actually change versus the cost to your legacy and direction versus what you could do outside the papacy that's constraining you when you're the Pope versus your own personal heart. I think all that weighing that provided to you at PM suggests that the Pope Francis should definitely resign. Couple of miscellaneous responses, right? So they say the cardinals vote, you obviously have more control of it when you're around there, but when you leave, you're still respected, as I've already explained. That means that the feeling of missing out, the analysis they provide you from opening opposition, makes no sense to me. Because if you feel like you should have left earlier because there's a youthful pope that's doing way more, that's something that will constantly plague you. It's probably constantly plaguing him right now. Not only, would a pope in my position be able to do more than I am old me able to do, or can I do more outside of the papacy than what I'm doing right now? And those are the nuance that Aisha brought you. That's the constant guilt that currently exists, and it's only alleviated by making this change. If he cares about his legacy, if he cares about the direction of the Catholic Church, he has far more control over it. When he's not the Pope, he should resign.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the case for opening opposition and the opening half of the debate.
Hi, can I be heard and seen?
You are visible and audible.
Thank you. Just give me 30 seconds to set up my timer and stuff. Cool. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll do something very simple. First, I'll respond to OG's first claim of how you can extend your control. Second, I'll talk about why OG's one argument basically double fucks themselves. Lastly, I'll do some weighing and talk about why personal benefits probably not as important as the church. Number one, opening government posits that you won't extend your control. You're going to be able to have control anyways because they're cardinals. You're going to be able to get the successor you want. Few responses here. Number one, if opening government concedes that control is important, surely you as a pope staying in power for more time gives you more control because you're more likely to appoint more cardinals. You're more likely to be able to spread more of your beliefs. You're more likely to form even more connections within the church and get more followers under your umbrella. And these are all people that are likely to improve your control over time, over a long period of time. And that means that getting that successor is actually more likely on our side. Open government also never proved to us why that successor has to be elected now in comparison to 10 years later after you're dead. Presumably, if the successor is a good one, ensuring that they get elected is the most important priority. And so giving yourself more time to ensure that you're able to ingrain your power further in the church probably is good. I think that the position of the Pope also gives you unique power because it allows you to say whatever you want to say and do whatever you want to say and give you governing power within the church. Opening government conveniently avoids the fact that literally, if you give up and resign, this naturally means that you give up on a bunch of powers. There are a few reasons why this is true. Number one, your cardinals are unlikely to listen to you anymore. This is because there's no religious reason inherently to listen to you, but even if there is, right, it's presumed that you're still God's child or something like that, or the most closest interpreter to God's words. There's no self-interested reason to listen to you anymore because presumably you're not really influencing their career in the future. They don't really care. And I think that you lose power significantly because the governing you're likely to lose you by default give up a bunch of powers, right? OG's argument specifically double fucks themselves because if it's the case that there are many structural barriers to creating more change, surely backsliding and overturning whatever changes that Pope Francis has done is very likely. You lose a significant amount of power in three ways. Number one, you're likely to lose power in terms of governing authority of the papacy. This means that the power to make decisions about church doctrine, about governance, about administrative matters, you lose all of that. This means that even if you can control the narratives of the church internally, and if the next pope and the conservative cardinals support someone else more conservative, you cannot control the external message that the church puts out. Secondly, you're likely to lose symbolic leadership, i.e., you're probably not going to be given as much screen time. The media is not going to come and report you if there's a new pope. If that pope talks about more conservative values, again, it's also likely that you lose screen time, you lose your ability to actually promote the values you want to talk about. But thirdly, you're also less likely to have influence over things like making and passing of new laws within the church. So sure, in the status quo, you might not be able to pass really progressive laws as a church we just are okay with abortion or whatever, but you're able to make small changes here and there, for example, supporting women in another way. All of these things you lose control over because you're unlikely to have an influence over those things. Why is a backsliding likely and why is conservative backsliding very likely? I mean, by OG's analysis, literally there's a huge population within a church right now that supports traditional church values that basically wants to overturn whatever Pope Francis has said. I think another empirical example of this is literally the example they use of Pope Benedict. From my understanding, Pope Benedict was actually quite known for being conservative and a traditional church supporter. So if it was up to him when he resigned, he surely wouldn't have wanted Pope Francis to be in position of power. But guess fucking what? Pope Francis did come to power, and it's someone that is entirely oppositional to how he views church values ought to be. This means that he probably does not have control over who gets to be appointed next. He also has no control over messaging of the church in the long term. I think the problem of then these things being overturned and having more traditional, seeing all of these changes that have been done overturned to some extent or some backsliding is going to do a few things. Number one, you're likely to face more criticism from secular movements. I.e., there's already been increasing, like in the past, there's been criticism of the church being not progressive enough. If you see and face more criticism as a result of like these overturning, this is probably bad for you to see as a like retired pope. The second, you're likely to alienate progressive followers because they might feel like these people are the leader that's leading the church is no longer someone that I can trust. So if OG is concerned about guilt, here's what's guilty. Because even in OG's case, knowing that like, you know, you might not be able to do better, it's probably worth to see all of these things backslide, because you will always ask yourself, am I the person that let this slide? But it's like, even in their best case, right? Like if someone does do better than you, presumably, even if you do about all of the analysis that there are structural barriers for you to improving, like presumably you would want to be the person that creates more change. So I'm not sure why on either side of the house you wouldn't want to stay in power, because once you lose power, you lose control. Whatever happens after you, you're unsure of who's going to replace you. There's that constant fear of asking yourself, what is going to happen? And that constant fear is probably the most proximate feeling you have. Before I move on, I'll take a point from closing. OG.
So all your analysis of backsliding being likely and the impacts from that is symmetric, and any radical policy you pass in the 10 years will be reversed then. So isn't it better to have some say over it as opposed to dying and not having any say when the selection happens outside your purview and you still be worried about what will happen?
Bro, we literally responded to you in Thej's speech. The difference is when you die, you don't know you lost control. This is because when you're dead, you can't feel that. Whereas on our side of the house, when that backsliding happens when you're alive, because you literally gave away power and some conservative cardinal now appoints someone else, you literally have to watch that play on the news. Your family tells you about it, then you're like, shit, maybe I shouldn't have stepped down. The bottom line of this argument is you will never know whether this person is going to be conservative or not, but you can't trust that yourself is always going to push for more progressive policies, or at least ensure that there's no backsliding that happens. So whatever changes you have achieved in your earlier years of careers, you will never let that slide back, and you never let that overturn. Once you die, I mean, unfortunately, it does mean that you have less control, but it also means that you will not see things go down, which is good on your personal level. Like I said, even if everything OG talks about is true, the fear of something potentially backsliding is going to be the most proximate feeling you have, because you've changed the church for so long. You've cared about all these things you've done. The worst thing that could happen to you is see all your hard work go to waste. You will never want that to happen, and therefore you will try to stay in power as much as possible. Opening government second analysis is just like, oh yeah, you want to spend time with your family or like talk to your niece or something. Like it's pretty hard to convince me that a pope that has literally worked in 20 years in a church cares about like golfing in comparison to this community, this institution they've been serving and setting up for the past 20 years. Church is the most powerful, like the pope is the most powerful position you can have at the moment for achieving any change. You will hold on to that because that ensures whatever you've done is not going to go to waste. All of these reasons, proud to be an opening opposition.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I now invite the member of government to extend the case for government bench. Hear, hear.
No. Okay. Okay, POS through. Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize. Okay. POS through one. How's it feel there? Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, no. Two extensions from closing government. Firstly, why can he fulfill his values much better if he retires? We're going to vertical opening government and explain why our mechanisms are far better than theirs. Secondly, even if the first argument isn't true, and even if we fail in influencing the next pope, even if the next pope is different, why that is far more valuable to you because you remain the stability in the Catholic Church. Firstly, why can he fulfill his values much better? We agree with open government. Francis cares about pushing his values. The question is how does he do it? Because the problem with open government thus far is their mechanisms are actually quite shallow. Like they only give two mechanisms. The first being, well, you are in the Vatican, so you can talk to the Pope. The second being, well, you're in the Vatican, so you can talk to the cardinals. But the problem with this is it assumes that these people have the predisposition to care about what you say, right? Like intuitively, as opening opposition points out, like the fact that Francis is a pope that Benedict did not want is probably testament to some kind of burden of proof coming from government to prove that the cardinals will actually listen to you and prove that you have some predisposition to be listened to in the first place. Why is it likely that the next pope will have Francis' influence? I have 4 reasons here. The first thing is to point out is the Council of Cardinals, which is where the next pope is elected from, is composed of people who are personally chosen by Pope Francis. Francis chooses the cardinals, so relatively, we are sure that they believe in roughly the same things. Yes, you cannot force them to vote for a particular way, like that's just reality, but we know that they are probably influenced to a significant degree. Secondly, the Vatican is similar in values, right? Like, sure, many local priests may disagree with what Francis is doing, but the Vatican and higher ranking officials in the Catholic Church are much more similar to his values. How will I prove this? I'd like to point out that the recent liberal decisions by Pope Francis to hang out with trans people, for example, to say that atheists can go to heaven, these liberal decisions are not done in a vacuum. What the Pope does is he convenes with a bunch of other people who can guide him because the Vatican is an entire body. He's just a poster boy for the Vatican, right? Which means that it is like just by construction, we are relatively sure that there is a good core group of people in the Vatican who actually do support what Francis is doing, which is why we're relatively sure that these people are like him in value. But thirdly, the future Pope is likely to listen and emulate Francis. Like, this is OG's first mechanism, which is like, well, you are near the new Pope. But it's not just about proximity, because you have to prove that this person will care. It's not just proximity, it's about authority. It's about papal infallibility. The fact that papal infallibility, the value of you believing that whatever the Pope is final, probably means to a great extent that the authority that you feel being around like the previous Pope is something that you relatively get as something that's very influential. But fourthly, it's the Overton window. That is, even if the next Pope is more conservative, it's not significantly more conservative, right? Because you've already shifted the window of accepted notions and values. What these 4 mechanisms prove is we do prove that the next Pope is likely to be influenced by Pope Francis. What that essentially means for the debate is that we explain why the values of Pope Francis are likely to be more, is likely to have continuity after his term. That's very important, right? It's not just the fact of we feel guilty for not doing anything. It's because, and this is the importance, having multiple or 2 popes being liberal is important for people to be able to accept your own views, right? Because the way that people oppose Francis right now is to say, well, he was just a fluke. Well, this is just his personal agenda. Well, it's just liberals influencing him. But once people are able to understand that it's not just this one single individual, but rather it's a trend of popes that are likely going to be liberal, this is the point at which people are likely to accept these things and likely to concede to the Pope's values, which is far more compelling than anything opening talks about, because opening government's mechanisms, again, I prove, are insufficient. And opening opposition's problem is really just not, like, their solution is just really not proven at this point in the debate. But even if the Pope has different values, we'll explain in the second extension why it's not significant. But yeah, like that's basically it for the first extension. This already beats opening half. Before that,
None of this engages with the argument we gave you that even if the next Pope aligns with you and does incredibly well, you feel really bad because you feel like you should have stepped down earlier, or there's someone doing something that you could be doing now. At least on our side, he can lie to himself and say after his death, he did everything he could have done, and the next Pope is going to carry on his legacy.
Yeah, okay. So the problem with this is that we like opening opposition, and this is the thing that kills their case. They assume that the Pope is such a selfish actor, right? Like clearly the Pope does care about his own values, but he does care about several other things. He cares about people being able to believe in it, even if it's not something that directly comes from him. Like this is just an assertion. Why is the Pope so selfish on the other side of the house? Like this is just a characterization that loses them the debate. Second extension then, even if the first argument isn't true and the next Pope is different, I'm going to engage with the POI here, by the way. Why is it better to remain stability? I like to point out, and this is engagement with the POI, the value of the Pope is not just about pushing your own values, but making sure that the church is stable. It's more important because it's the prerequisite for anyone to believe and engage properly. It's the prerequisite for individual local churches to make sure that these people are able to practice in, like in a collective nature. The problem in status quo is there's actually huge instability in local churches. This is the first problem because it's extremely radically liberal coming from the part of Pope Francis, right? Because the vast majority of Catholics are conservative. Maya, this is the part here. Because firstly, it's generational religious practice that these things are passed on generation to generation, and the vast majority of popes in the past were conservative. But secondly, there's just no precedent until now to have liberal values by the Pope. So most Catholics actually do oppose his actions. He is seen as opposing to true Catholic values. It looks like thousands of priests disagreeing because they regionally agree or collectively agree in certain locales that what he's doing is a farce to the church. Millions of people not being able to buy in because there's a cultural difference in being able to understand what exactly he's saying, because for generations they've believed something different because you're too liberal. But secondly, there's a huge amount of heat because of comments on Israel. Like, I'm not saying any of my opinions here, but him calling Israel's actions terrorist causes a huge hot seat to the Vatican because now he's being questioned of whether he sides with Israel or Palestine or not. This is the most important harm in the debate, because it's not just inaction and the guilt of having inaction. There are many reasons why the church is hugely unstable. This is far larger harm because it's not just guilt. It's the fact that you feel personally that you are the reason as to why many people aren't able to participate in the church properly, why many people countlessly disagree on the certain values that you have. The fact that this is you're doing is something to feel far more guilty about, because the ability to practice your religion comes far before the ability to practice your version of that religion. So if it does end up backsliding, we think it is far better for us and far able to accept it more, and we're actually far happier with that, because that's a confirmation that this is the most democratic decision for the church, that this is something that the church itself wants, that you probably have done the wrong thing, and this is a confirmation that the church is headed in the right direction. As the Pope, you are far more able to understand that this is something that is larger than you, and the ability to serve other individuals, billions across the world, is something that is a value that is far larger than your own personal opinions, just on scale, just on the ability to access religion, just on the ability to access Catholicism. So, so if they're saying, well, what if the person is going to be more conservative? The fact of papal infallibility, that everyone has to understand that the next Pope is someone that is infallible, and you have to understand and observe and respect them, is something that the Pope, like Pope Francis right now, already believes in. These are things that guarantee the stability of the church, but just as a worst case, but we do prove far better than opening government why you're going to have that influence. For those reasons, closing them.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I now invite the member of opposition to extend the case for opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you hear me? Checking.
Sorry, I can hear you. Sorry.
All right, PRs in the chat. I'll take OG, somewhere around 5 minutes. Okay. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, the kind of ideals that the Pope largely believes in, like I think explaining this vertically better than what opening opposition does. And secondly, it's going to be in terms of why the conservative backlash significantly amplifies when you do something that has literally been done once in the last 600 years. Firstly, then, in terms of the kind of values that the Pope, we feel, or the way his conscience largely works. Because the way I think Christian doctrines and ideals largely work is the process of continuous service to God. So like Jesuit institutions propagating, it's a process of lifelong service, commitment, and dedication, and a process of lifelong learning. Which means to say, at that point of time, opening government's framing that probably you need a break, or probably you want to go to your family, or probably you want to take a vacation. These things don't work, because point at which when you have committed yourself to a life of utmost sacrifice, I'm not sure why there's an inflection point at which you want to retire. Probably in a capitalist world with a 9-to-5 job, after 60 you want to retire and go to the Amalfi Coast. I don't think he wants to leave the Vatican anytime soon, simply because the way largely it's been a process of selfless sacrifice. At that point of time, it's very unlikely why he needs the alternative. But secondly, I think it's very difficult then to fit into the alternative in terms of, say, for example, not doing enough or not being in a position of power, or literally like taking a vacation. I don't think this is some things that the Pope is used to doing or they're used to believing in the first place. But thirdly, I think the laws of Vatican and largely how your conscience is largely framed is on custom. That is to say, things that are customary and have been happening for, say, historically for thousands of years are things that individuals automatically believe in, because these are things apparently thought of to be passed on as word of God. Which means to say, if in the last 600 years, and I'm not sure what before that, like if resignation has happened only once, it's largely true that the customs largely drive you and your mental conscience in a way to believe that resignation is not something that's normal and is something that is an exception to the norm. Which means at this point of time, I don't think his conscience is something that's going to be more permitting of him to essentially go ahead and resign and be happy with that decision, which I think deals with the mental calculus so-called analysis that OG says. Secondly, they say, and this is, I think, the largest chunk, that you can influence a bunch of cardinals, something that I think CG just echoes throughout their speeches in terms of you selecting whom you can appoint or not. Note, I think perceptions drastically and more radically change when you're able to like go ahead and pass legislation in terms of literally making historical judgments, such as like we accept like same-sex civil unions, or say for example like going into far-flung areas and caring about healthcare, literally recently interacting with African Jesuits, or say for example calling for peace. I think the kind of like LGBTQ legislations that Pope has largely advocated, or say for example the liberal values that he passes, and the point at which when you're in an office and essentially go ahead and have the capacity to do so, or are in a position of power to do so, I think that point of time you're much more likely to influence that moderate cardinal perhaps in terms of like shifting their opinions when they actually see legislation work out, people accepting those legislation, and they literally being driven from there. Which means to say, in that regard, I think the so-called moderate cardinal that even CG wants to convince is more likely to happen on our side when you literally go ahead and pass those legislations and see that perception drastically change, or even like organically change over time. Because point at which like their impacts are literally speculative. Because if the Pope resigns, I'm not sure why the subsequent cardinals are going to elect somebody moderate, which they are not sure on their side of the house as well. But secondly here, why is the perception of the church likely to be worse off? And we think we're going to amplify backlash more than what opening opposition does. Because I think opening opposition is a one-liner in LO when they say you see everything going down and all the good work basically crumbling. I don't think they prove in terms of why this is actually likely to happen. Firstly, I think the conservatives, which are largely the biggest funders of your Catholic Church, and this is important because we don't think like liberal individuals largely contribute as much to the church. Because for you to essentially part a huge amount of your wealth, for you to essentially take time off and go to church daily, or like be literally committed and devoted to this institution, means that you have to essentially be to an extent radically involved in this organization in the first place. That is why conservatives are more likely to go ahead and contribute and essentially have a greater amount of influence in that regard. But secondly, with the point at which when you go ahead and do resign, I think this amplifies criticism and skepticism even more. Because note, you're going against customary historical precedents, which means to say that point at which Benedict's resignation came in was largely seen as an exception to the rule. When say for example there were conspiracy theories and people literally attacked the position of the Catholic Church, whether it has the command to essentially maintain its authority or not. So which means even if there is a slight chance of skepticism, we think that is largely likely to be significantly amplified by the conservatives and individuals in general, which now can further weaponize narratives against him. Look, this is an individual who's already going against the institution by promoting, say for example, civil unions for same-sex couples. Right now is also like disregarding the authority of the historical position by also resigning at the same time, which has literally been done once in the last 600 years. I think this provides the perfect fodder for conservatives to amplify criticism and even more against the Pope and literally lead to the kind of harms that opening opposition talks about. Which means to say we don't want to give them the ammunition and say for example preserve the so-called sanctity in terms of like what do you call inheritance of the church, that to essentially not invite the amount of backlash. But what are the harms out of it? I think firstly, then which means the position of the church is more likely to come under question, or also the institution and largely in general. Which means to say individual, like literally at a time when more and more individuals are literally moving out of Christianity, or like say atheism is on the rise in Europe. I think this is the last thing that the Pope or the church essentially want, because this means individuals have a potential to cut down on funding or say contribute less to the church, that then hinders their ability to essentially go ahead and perform the kind of programs or the say for example do the kind of things that they want to do. Which means to say the church largely looks as a weak organization, which reduces the amount of perception and the commanding authority that it has in general. So at that point of time, that's not something that the Pope would want to see. We want to move on. Yes, OG.
The conservative Pope Benedict and multiple others have stepped down with no conservative backlash. Given that the Catholic Church constrains your ability to meet the religious mandate you deeply feel, which no one on opposition disproves, why can't you meet that better outside the church through op-eds, influence, and direct advocacy for those you care about?
Sure. I think individuals need ammunition and fodder at every point of time to essentially criticize the kind of things that you're doing or do you want to do. So this literally provides like an additional avenue for them to go ahead and kind of propagate the so-called skepticism that they have towards you. But I don't think any of the gov benches also prove that doing all of those things such as writing op-ed columns and influencing individuals cannot be done when you're anyway in a position of power. People are more likely to listen to you and respect you and give you the sense of control at that point of time. I'm just unclear in terms of why that can't be done if you continue to be in power. But secondly, like if conservatives block every possible policy outcome that you have, like I'm not sure that if you resign, why is that then likely to change on your side of the house? I think probably then if you do have some level of influence right now, I think as we mentioned, the moderate cardinal is more likely to sway point of which they actually see legislation working out. We explain on our side why this provides more amount of skepticism and creates more amount of like backlash and ammunition and fodder that the conservatives can further weaponize, what you call delegitimizing the authority of the church. For those reasons, CEO.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and I invite Government Whip to conclude the case for Government Bench here.
Hello, am I audible? I hope that's a yes.
You are audible.
All right, wonderful, thank you. My pronouns are she, her. I'll take you guys through chat, and I must warn, I am sick. So you will hear my coughing, and I will be very sorry. All right. Starting my speech. First thing I want to resolve, will the successor actually be able, or are we able to ensure that the successor will have similar or the same values as Pope Francis? We on CG give you a couple of reasons as to why this is likely. Number one, you assemble the voting cardinal. You literally control the values of the individuals who are going to be deciding the next Pope. Number two, the fact that you take the position as the previous Pope means you already carry like significant influence, being the predecessor, being the person that the new Pope usually tries to emulate, but also because of the fact that you serve as guidance. Because the opposition tries to minimize it by saying, oh, well, Pope Benedict disagreed with a lot of the things Pope Francis said. Yeah, but Pope Francis still went on walks with Pope Benedict. Pope Francis clearly still held Pope Benedict's opinion to a very, very high regard. And we don't think that's an insignificant amount of influence to have on the next Pope, right? They try to say that, oh, people might disagree with you. Pope, like the cardinals voted for Pope Francis, even though Pope Benedict didn't like him. Okay, let's talk about what this then suggests to us. First, intuition pump. If it is true, then that means that even the cardinals that Pope Benedict personally agreed with shows that they have an increasing trend towards the values that Pope Francis already cares about. Meaning, even if the most conservative Pope chose the cardinals for choosing, it shows to us that the overall Vatican, or at the very least the people within high and like powerful positions, already probably have or hold similar or the same sentiments as Pope Francis, right? But second, intuition pump, the fact that Pope Francis doesn't make these decisions in a vacuum. He doesn't just decide things on his own. He consults other people all the time. And if it is true that this is the result of his decisions, it suggests to us that a lot of people that he was consulting with, that he talked to, probably hold similar or the very same positions that he does. Even if people dislike Francis, but even if it is true that people do not like Francis, I still like mitigate that through the ideas, the fact that he assembles the voting bloc and controls the values of the individuals who are choosing the next Pope, right? Why is it so important that we're able to clear this out coming from closing government? Number one, if they have the same values, it shows that the harm of opening opposition's idea of dismantling the entire things that you set up is unlikely to happen. The harm of things like backsliding is unlikely to happen. But thirdly, and most importantly, it counters the claim on things of conservative backlash. We told you coming from closing government that this backlash exists because people directly relate the ideas of liberalism to their personal hate for Francis as an individual. Meaning even all of the reasons that opposition gives as to why people do not like these liberal values, all of them are incredibly personal to Francis as a person. People hate a lot of these things, not because people hate Pope Francis, not necessarily just because of his values, but they feel he isn't representative of the church and has a singular agenda that he's imposing as a pope. We tell you that when you're able to control the values of your successor, you show that these liberal values are not just your individual agenda as Pope Francis, but you're able to show that this is actually a united representation of the principles that the Vatican holds to be important. And this, we think, makes it much more convincing for other individuals to believe in a lot of the principles and values that Pope Francis wants to push when they realize that it's not an individual agenda that Pope Francis is pushing, but rather is a shift in the overall progressive principles that the Catholic Church wants to be able to take in the future. Before I move on, POI from opening.
Our arguments are smart because they don't rely on the probability game of whether or not he can do more, whether or not his successor will be good or bad. We told you he will always feel powerful and good because he objectively has more power over doctrine and personnel as Pope, and his family and closest followers will always support him and tell him that he's doing good and help him weather critique.
Okay, so if your problem is where you get more power, I'll flag it when I responded directly in my issue. But my first response here right now is just that if people believe you are pushing an agenda, it doesn't matter what you say or what you do. People are going to be set and dead on not to listen to you. You need to show that the things you're saying is not you pushing a personal agenda, but is instead representative of the overall values that the Catholic Church and the Vatican want to actually push. And that is the only time you're able to get people to actually buy into the values you want to push in the first place. More on that later. Why then do we weigh opening government? 2 reasons. Firstly, because their issue on health doesn't matter. We don't know if this is the actual priority of the church. They say that, oh, this thing is exhausting and political. We think this is probably a willing trade-off he was willing to make on the accepting of the position of being a pope in the first place. Things like being old and having limited capacity, all of these things are incredibly mitigated. I'm not sure why this is true. We also think like these things just aren't fully proven as to why they are true, and if they are true, why these are specifically important to the Pope's to the Pope's interests, right? We also think it's unclear, like these personal interests weigh unclearly against his greater spiritual obligation that he opted into upon accepting the position of being a pope. We tell you that we have to win over opening government because we prove the likelihood as to why the next pope is likely going to hold the same values of Pope Francis. They rely on things like being able to talk to the Pope and being able to lobby towards cardinals. We give you structural reasons as to why it's most likely that not only do you are able to influence the next pope, but the next pope and the people within the Vatican likely hold the exact same values and belief systems that you do. Meaning, CG is analytically prior to a lot of the impacts that opening government wants to push. Whereas opening government asserts that you will have influence, we prove to you why it's likely your influence will be successful. Why then is influence exclusive on our side? A few reasons. Because the influence that exists on opposition is always going to be limited. Because when you die, you have no influence and control at all. But secondly, because the extent of influence you have on the public on opposition is incredibly limited. The same framing, and we prove this, because the same framing that OO gives on reasons why people don't listen to Francis, the fact that he's radical, that he's controversial, we tell you the influence is much worse on opposition because these liberal values are only associated, limited to Pope Francis. Establishing continuity strengthens the likelihood for other individuals to listen to you. And this is where we respond to closing opposition, where you talk about how you're going to receive backlash over your resignation. Number one, this is unimportant. I don't think he cares that much about backlash since he's already controversial. But also, like Pope Benedict is a very recent predecessor. He has a very recent precedent of stepping down, so I'm not sure why this backlash is likely going to be true. But if it is true that people already don't like Pope Francis, then it's unlikely for this backlash to occur because they won't care because he's not a priest anymore. But secondly, it supports the CG case on continuity, because if you receive backlash over resignation, it's fine because you're going to have influence over the next pope, meaning people are more likely going to listen to the next pope anyway. What are the impacts of this? Very simply, number one, when you have continuity, it means your positions look less radical. We weigh over opening government because they stop where the actions happen, at the actions of the pope. CG goes into why the imposition of Pope Francis values is likely going to be successful locally. We engage with CEO when they say that things like, oh, you're still going to be able to pass laws. It's only on our side where we promote where you are likely going to have these laws be accepted publicly, right? We tell you, when we talk about Pope Francis' interests, don't listen to opening opposition. When they say that Pope Francis has an interest of not feeling bad, and because he's gonna feel bad if he retires early because he's gonna feel like he should have retired earlier. All of these things are secondary to his want to be able to fulfill his obligation as a pope, his want to fulfill his duties towards his principles. But lastly, and this is where we'd be extremely generous, where we assume it is true that he is selfish, where we assume that it is true that the next pope will not listen to you, we still think Pope Francis has his own personal reasons as to why it's good to retire. The fact that his position as pope has created more instability, meaning, and when we weigh this over, meaning that the pope probably cares more about the individual principles of everyone, which is to say that even if he's completely a failure in pushing towards his values, we think these things are still probably more important to him. All these things very proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank that speaker for that very fine speech and now invite the opposition whip to conclude the case for opposition bench and the debate.